They say love should feel like home. Safe, easy, effortless. But what if love feels more like a second shift you never asked to clock into? I didn't realize I was drowning until I finally came up for air, and by then, I was already waist deep in someone else's unfinished dreams. His name was Mason. To the outside world, Mason was charismatic, funny, the kind of man who could talk his way into any room. But behind closed doors, where charm fades and reality settles, I began to understand that love, real love, cannot survive on borrowed potential. We met in Boston. I was 27, finishing my last semester of grad school, working part-time at a coffee shop near Beacon Hill. Mason was 34, managing deliveries for a local brewery. He had a roughness about him that felt real in a city full of polished ambition. I fell for that honesty, or what I thought was honesty. We bonded over our broken beginnings. I had grown up in a house where silence screamed louder than words. He had been raised by parents who bet away his childhood, leaving him to clean up the wreckage in adulthood. At first, it felt like we were building something solid. We joked about our broke college meals and promised each other that one day we'd eat at a place with more than paper menus. He liked how driven I was. I liked how free he seemed. He didn't care about appearances or fitting into corporate boxes. He was messy and bold and alive, but I mistook chaos for passion. It started small. He moved in after I found a place in Cambridge with enough room for two. Rent was brutal, but I had just landed a job offer from a marketing firm that promised remote flexibility. Mason, still figuring things out, was honest about his debt and inability to split rent down the middle. I covered 80%. He promised it was temporary. I wanted to believe him. I told myself we were a team. That love was about sacrifice. That money didn't matter. That we were fighting the same fight. But it didn't take long to notice the imbalance. Mason worked long hours. That was true. But so did I. My job didn't leave bruises on my hands, but it gnawed at my brain and stretched my patience thin. After work, he'd drop onto the couch, crack open a beer, and vanish into the TV. I'd clean up after both of us, cook, fold laundry, wipe down the kitchen, and take out the trash. Except that last part. That was his one job. The trash. I asked, nicely. I reminded him gently. I left notes. He still forgot. Always. I remember one weekend when I had to go into the office unexpectedly. When I came home that evening, the apartment looked like it had hosted a frat party and a food fight. Empty chip bags, dirty dishes stacked high, takeout boxes leaking sauce on the counter, laundry spilling over. The smell hit me before I even turned on the lights. I stood there, keys in hand, staring into the mess. It wasn't just the apartment. It was our entire relationship, laid bare in grease stains and crusted plates. I spent the next 2 hours cleaning. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't relax in chaos, because I knew Mason wouldn't, because I didn't want to fight. When he came home later that night, he kissed my forehead and told me he missed me. Then he turned on the game, never noticed the clean counters, never noticed my red, cracked hands from scrubbing, never said thank you. That night, I cried into my pillow as he snored beside me. There's something uniquely cruel about being invisible in your own home. The next morning, I snapped. Not in an explosive way. In the quiet, exhausted way that comes from carrying too much for too long. When he asked what was for breakfast, I told him he could make his own damn eggs. He blinked, confused, called me rude. I told him I was tired of being his unpaid maid. He laughed, said I was overreacting, that I knew his job was hard, that he deserved to unwind. And what about me? I asked. He shrugged, told me he never asked me to do those things, that if I wanted to stop, I should just stop, that his mom always did those things for his dad and never complained. That was the moment something inside me hardened. Not out of hate, out of clarity. I looked at Mason and saw a man who didn't want a partner. He wanted a mother he could sleep with. I stopped doing his laundry. I stopped cooking his meals. I stopped pretending we were a team. I made space for silence. The dishes piled up. The house smelled like rot. I ordered takeout and threw the boxes away immediately. When the rent came due, I paid only my half and told our landlord Mason would handle the rest. He didn't take it well. He yelled, accused me of being selfish, said I was changing, said he missed the old me. I told him the old me was tired. Some people think breaking up is one big moment, a single fight, a betrayal. But sometimes it's a slow death, a quiet unraveling, like realizing your plants are dying not because you forgot to water them, but because they've been sitting in the dark for months. We were already broken when Mason met her, Clarissa, a client's daughter, rich, confident, perfect hair, the kind of woman who never worked a retail job or waited for a paycheck to hit. He talked about her more and more, not in a cheating way. At first, then one night, drunk, he confessed, said he was falling in love with her, said she was everything I wasn't, said she made him feel like a man. I stared at him, expressionless. I had no tears left, just a strange numbness. I told him he could move out by the end of the week. He didn't believe me. The next day, I boxed his things, left them by the door. He called me cold, said I was giving up. I told him I was finally waking up. He moved in with Clarissa a week later. I should have been angry. Maybe I was. But mostly, I felt relief. Like I had finally set down a backpack full of stones I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I started running again. Every morning along the Charles, watching the city come alive. I went out with friends, took weekend trips, slept in the middle of the bed. For the first time in years, my home felt like mine. I thought the story had ended, but the universe wasn't done with us yet. 2 months later, an envelope arrived. No return address, thick cardstock, embossed lettering. Inside was a wedding invitation, Mason and Clarissa, happily ever after, and in the corner, scribbled in his handwriting, one final gut punch. Come see what a real woman looks like. It took everything in me not to scream. But I didn't scream. I smiled, because I had a plan. And if Mason wanted me at his wedding so badly, I was going to give him a reason to regret it forever. The week after I received Mason and Clarissa's wedding invitation, I found myself staring out the window of a Brooklyn cafe, watching people move on with their lives, sipping coffee, laughing, living. I remember thinking how strange it was that the world just keeps turning even when yours has been knocked off its axis. I had already mourned Mason. I had let go, or at least I thought I had. But the note on that invitation didn't just sting, it burned. It wasn't heartbreak I felt. It was humiliation, the kind that settles deep in your bones. It wasn't enough that he left me for someone else. It wasn't enough that he used my love like a ladder. He wanted me to watch him climb it. That was the part I couldn't shake. The cruelty wasn't in the abandonment. It was in the performance. That same night, I opened my laptop, not to wallow, but to remember. I wanted to remind myself who I had become since Mason. I clicked open the folders I had made since he left. New photos from solo hikes in Cold Spring, a folder of client presentations from work that had gotten rave reviews, saved screenshots of texts from colleagues saying how much they respected me. All little pieces of a new life he had no part in. Still, there was a gnawing ache I couldn't ignore. Not sadness, not jealousy. Just this quiet, persistent voice whispering, "You never got the apology. You never got the closure. You never got justice." Closure is a funny thing. We're told it's internal, that it comes from within. But sometimes, Closure looks like standing in the same room as the person who broke you and showing them they no longer have power over your story, that they didn't win, that they never held the pen. And I realized then that was what I needed. Not revenge, not drama, just to reclaim the narrative. So I RSVP'd yes, with a +1. Not to be petty, but to be present, to be undeniable. But then came the question, who? Who would I bring to this spectacle? Who could stand beside me with enough quiet confidence to disarm Mason's performance? That was when I remembered something from the deep scrolls of Clarissa's Instagram, from those many late nights after the breakup, where curiosity blurred into self-harm. A man named Eli. The ex. Her high school sweetheart. The one she used to post endlessly about until he vanished from her feed. I had always assumed they split on good terms. It was hard to imagine someone like Clarissa being left. But digging deeper, I found a few cryptic posts that hinted otherwise, enough to know their ending hadn't been clean. So I reached out, sent a friend request, didn't expect much, but he accepted. I messaged him. I was honest. I told him who I was and what Mason had done. I told him about the wedding, about the note. I didn't beg or plead, just laid it out. And to my surprise, Eli replied within the hour. He was polite, curious, cautious. We talked for 3 hours that night. It started with polite small talk, but soon it became a confessional. He told me Clarissa had cheated on him with Mason, that he found out when he overheard her laughing, on the phone with a friend, describing how easily Mason had swept her off her feet. He said he hadn't gone to a single wedding since, that he hadn't dated seriously in over a year, that her betrayal had left him doubting every instinct he once trusted. There was something eerily beautiful about the symmetry. Both of us used. Both of us discarded. Both of us watching people we once loved now build a new life together, without so much as a backward glance. We didn't say it aloud, but I think we both knew what this meant. Healing wouldn't come from ignoring the wound. It would come from walking into the fire and realizing it could no longer burn you. Eli agreed to go. Not as a date, not as a ploy, as a witness, as a quiet act of reclamation. The days that followed were oddly peaceful. I went to work, attended meetings, did yoga in Prospect Park, shopped for a dress that felt powerful instead of pretty. It wasn't about looking better than Clarissa. It was about looking like the version of me that Mason never got to see, the one who didn't need him. I also started writing again, journaling, reflecting. I remembered how I used to write poetry, before Mason, how I'd once dreamed of publishing a book of essays about womanhood, ambition, and heartbreak. I hadn't touched those dreams in years. But now, with this strange new chapter unfolding, I found myself wanting to document every part of it. Not for revenge, for record. For me. A week before the wedding, Eli and I met in person for the first time. We chose a rooftop bar in Soho, surrounded by fairy lights and the buzz of the city. He was even quieter in person, with thoughtful eyes and a nervous energy that mirrored my own. We talked for hours, not just about Mason and Clarissa, but about books and movies and childhood and regrets. We didn't flirt. There was no tension. Just a kind of soul-level companionship that felt rare and honest. Before we parted that night, he looked at me and said, "Whatever happens at that wedding, I want you to know you've already won. Just showing up as you are is the win." That stuck with me. It still does. I spent the next few days in a quiet state of preparation. Not just outwardly, choosing the dress, practicing my makeup, finalizing the RSVP details, but inwardly. I wrote letters I didn't send. One to Mason, one to my past self, one to the version of me who believed love had to hurt to be real. I burned them in my sink, watched the paper curl and disappear. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Mason's face when he'd see me walk in, wondering if Clarissa would recognize Eli immediately, wondering if this whole thing would backfire. But I reminded myself again and again, this wasn't about them. It was about me, my story, my closure. And I was ready to walk into it with my head held high. Because sometimes, the cost of carrying someone else's dream isn't just financial. It's emotional. It's spiritual. You lose time. You lose confidence. You lose yourself. But when you finally put it down, when you finally realize it was never your burden to carry in the first place, something shifts. You remember who you were before you became the support beam in someone else's crumbling life. You remember what you deserve, and what I deserved was peace. Not perfection, not pity, just peace. And I was finally ready to go get it. The wedding day crept closer with every sunrise, and with it, a growing electricity in the air I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't excitement. It was anticipation laced with clarity, the kind of stillness that comes when you know exactly who you are and what you need to do. I didn't imagine Mason expected me to show up. He sent that invitation as a performance, a piece of theater meant to provoke, not invite. He wanted to be seen. He wanted me to hurt. He wanted to play the victorious groom to a carefully curated audience. But what he didn't realize was that he wasn't the only one who had been watching. The note he scrawled at the bottom of the card echoed in my head for days. Come see what a real woman looks like. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't rage. What I felt was sharper, more precise. It was the sensation of a switch flipping. I wasn't going to walk into that room to compare myself to Clarissa. I was going to remind myself, and him, who I had become in his absence. The kind of woman who never needed to be validated by wealth or charm, or a man who only knew how to take. The logistics came together faster than I anticipated. Eli and I coordinated our plans with the kind of easy rhythm that came from shared purpose. We weren't out for revenge. We weren't out to humiliate anyone. But we both deserved to reclaim some dignity. Not from anyone else, but from the parts of ourselves that still wondered if we had been the problem. Clarissa had made us both question our worth. Mason had made me question my strength. Walking into that room wasn't about confronting them. It was about confronting the versions of ourselves who had once stayed quiet, who had once settled. A week before the wedding, I received a message from a former friend of Mason's, a guy named Troy, who used to hang out with us in Boston. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe over a year, but his message was concise and surprisingly vulnerable. He talks about you like you were the mistake he had to survive. Just thought you should know. It didn't sting the way I expected. If anything, it confirmed what I already suspected. Mason had rewritten the narrative to suit his ego. He needed to believe that I had held him back, that he had somehow outgrown me. The idea that I had carried him, emotionally and financially, never seemed to register. He never saw the sacrifices as love. He saw them as currency he was owed. But I wasn't going to argue with his version. I was going to outgrow it. Eli and I met again the night before the ceremony. It was raining in Manhattan, a steady drizzle that turned the sidewalks slick and reflective. We sat under a covered terrace, sipping dark roast coffee and watching the clouds curl against the city skyline. There was a quiet tension in the air, not from nerves, but from the weight of what was coming. "Are you ready for this?" I asked. Eli shrugged. "I don't know, but I think I need it. Maybe we both do." There was something strangely comforting in his uncertainty. Neither of us pretended to have it all figured out. We were just two people showing up for ourselves, one moment at a time. We talked about what we might say if Clarissa approached, what Mason might do if he saw us. But mostly we talked about what came after. Not just the wedding, but everything else. Our plans, our goals, what we wanted out of life now that we weren't stuck inside someone else's expectations. It wasn't a date, but it felt more intimate than any date I'd ever been on. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I had in weeks. The city felt different, charged, alive. I laid out the dress I'd chosen, sleek, modern, and simple. Not flashy, not loud, just powerful. The kind of dress you wear when you're not trying to be remembered for what you wore, but for the presence you carried in it. Eli picked me up in a rented black sedan. He looked calm, but I could see the nervous energy under his steady gaze. We didn't speak much on the way to the venue. Central Park was buzzing with life. Joggers, tourists, street musicians playing hopeful tunes on battered saxophones. The wedding was set in a garden space on the east side, full of white chairs, floral arches, and champagne flutes waiting to be filled. When we stepped into the reception area, time seemed to pause. I saw Mason before he saw me. He was standing near the bar, laughing too loudly at something one of his groomsmen said. He looked thinner than I remembered, but still carried that same cocky swagger. When his eyes landed on me, and then on Eli, I watched the color drain from his face. He started toward us, fast, almost stumbling over his words. "Zoe? What the hell is this?" I smiled politely. "Hi, Mason. Beautiful venue." His eyes darted to Eli. "You brought him? Are you serious? What are you trying to pull?" I leaned in slightly. "I'm not trying to pull anything. I was invited. You made sure of that. And this is my +1. He couldn't make a scene. Not in front of his guests. So he muttered something under his breath and stormed off. Eli and I found our seats. The ceremony was about to begin. When Clarissa appeared, dressed in an ornate gown that shimmered with each step, I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes as they locked onto Eli. Her smile faltered. She blinked slowly, and for a moment, it felt like we were all holding our breath. But the ceremony proceeded. Vows were exchanged. Rings slipped on fingers. And as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, I felt nothing. No heartbreak, no jealousy. Just a quiet sense of detachment. It was like watching the final scene of a movie you'd already predicted. At the reception, Clarissa finally approached. Her voice was sharp, forced into politeness. "Eli, can we talk?" He nodded and followed her out to a balcony overlooking the gardens. I stayed behind, sipping sparkling water, watching guests swirl around the dance floor. Mason kept glancing at me, irritation etched across his face. He was unraveling. His perfect day was now riddled with questions. An hour passed, then 2. The bride had not returned. People were starting to whisper. Her father looked panicked. A bridesmaid rushed inside, holding a folded note. She handed it to the DJ, who silenced the music and stepped up to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to read a message from Clarissa." The room fell silent. Seeing Eli today reminded me of the woman I used to be, the one I left behind when I started chasing something that never felt quite real. I have made a mistake. And I need time to figure out who I am outside of all of this. I'm sorry to everyone, but I can't go through with this. Gasps echoed. Chairs scraped back. Mason stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his fists clenched. He was alone. Clarissa was gone, and I had never felt more free. In that moment, I realized something profound. I had walked into that wedding with a heart still partially tethered to a past that didn't serve me. But I was walking out with something so much more powerful than closure. I had walked back into myself, and nothing, not Mason's cruelty, not Clarissa's absence, not the shock in the room, could take that from me again. The silence after Clarissa's note was read out loud, hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Guests stood frozen. Champagne flutes in midair. Conversations halted mid-laugh. All eyes drifted toward the spot she had vanished from just an hour earlier, now hauntingly empty. A wedding that was orchestrated down to the last floral centerpiece had just crumbled into stunned whispers, clicking heels, and awkward glances. Mason remained still, his jaw locked, his face pale with a shade of disbelief that was both theatrical and horrifyingly real. He wasn't just abandoned. He had been exposed. I watched him from across the room. The man who once told me I wasn't enough, whose final gift to our relationship had been a card inviting me to witness his victory. Only now, he stood amid the ruins of that illusion, his perfect day twisted into a cautionary tale. There was no joy in watching him fall, only clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when truth slices through delusion like a blade. Mason wasn't the villain of some movie. He was a man who thought love was something you could win, rather than something you had to earn. Eli returned from the balcony moments after the note was read, his expression unreadable. I looked at him, searching his eyes for some clue, some answer to what had been said between them. He sat down beside me quietly. We didn't speak for a long while. There was nothing to say. We just sat in the chaos, the epicenter of a storm we hadn't meant to unleash, but also hadn't feared. Mason paced. He whispered harshly to one of the groomsmen. He grabbed his phone, dialed furiously, only to lower it after a few seconds, shaking his head. Clarissa was gone. She had left her own wedding with the man she used to love, the one she tried to forget by building a life with someone who never quite saw her for who she was. I didn't celebrate her decision, but I understood it. When the noise of expectation gets too loud, sometimes the only way to hear your own voice again is to walk away from everything and start over. People began leaving, slowly at first, then in waves. Her parents tried to maintain composure, offering tight smiles and stiff apologies to confused guests. But no one could pretend this hadn't happened. The spell was broken. Mason eventually made his way back to our side of the room. I braced myself, but Eli remained calm, unmoving. Mason looked at him first, eyes full of accusation, then at me. But this wasn't the man I remembered. This was someone unraveling. "Did you plan this?" he hissed, his voice low, trembling with something between rage and despair. "No," I said calmly. "We just showed up, like you asked us to." His nostrils flared. "You brought him here to ruin my wedding." "No," Eli answered before I could. "She brought me here to witness the truth. Everything else wasn't part of the plan." Mason laughed bitterly. "You think this makes you better than me? Coming in here stealing the bride?" Eli leaned forward, voice quiet. "You lost her long before today, and you never even noticed." It was the first time I saw Mason genuinely speechless. He didn't yell. He didn't throw a glass. He just blinked, stunned, like the realization had only just begun to register, that his power wasn't real, that the version of himself he sold to Clarissa, to the guests, to me, was never built on anything stable. He turned away, walked back to the head table and sank into a chair, shoulders slumped. I didn't follow. I didn't feel bad. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I no longer felt responsible for his healing. I had carried that burden for too long. After a while, Eli and I stepped outside. The cool evening air wrapped around us, quieting the noise still echoing from inside. We walked down the path leading toward the park gates, saying nothing. There was a kind of reverence between us now. Not romantic, not dramatic. Just honest. When we reached the edge of the garden, Eli stopped. "You okay?" I nodded. Are you? He hesitated. I didn't expect her to leave. Not really. I thought maybe closure would be knowing she chose someone else. But now, closure isn't about who they choose, I said. It's about choosing yourself. He smiled faintly. Then maybe we both got what we came for. We said goodbye shortly after. There was no grand farewell, no promises to meet again. Just a long look, a thank you, and the comfort of knowing that our part in each other's story was finished. Or maybe just beginning, but neither of us needed to define it. I walked home through the city alone, the sounds of honking taxis and distant music floating in the air. I thought about how weddings are supposed to symbolize beginnings, but sometimes they reveal endings. Honest, brutal, necessary endings. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages. Friends who had seen the posts, the rumors, the drama unfolding, online. Clarissa had gone radio silent. Mason's social media had been wiped clean. Eli hadn't posted anything. Neither had I. We didn't need to. The real story wasn't for everyone else. It was for us. I made coffee and sat by my window, watching the early sun filter through the skyline. For the first time in years, I wasn't replaying conversations in my head. I wasn't wondering what I should have said, or how I should have acted. I was just still. There was a new peace in the silence. I pulled out my journal and began to write. Not about Mason, not about Clarissa, about Zoe. About the girl who once thought love was measured in endurance. About the woman who learned that leaving isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That healing isn't passive, it's defiant. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk into the very room designed to break you and walk out whole. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew what wouldn't. No more shrinking to make someone else comfortable. No more carrying the weight of unspoken apologies. No more invitations wrapped in insult. Just me. Fully me. And that was more than enough. 1 month passed after the wedding that wasn't, and life began to take on a strange, quiet rhythm. The kind of peace that doesn't come in loud declarations, but in small acts of returning to yourself. I found it in my morning rituals, making coffee just the way I liked it, reading in bed past noon on Saturdays, walking aimlessly through bookstores and letting the pages of strangers' stories brush against my fingertips. There was no big epiphany, no dramatic transformation, just a gradual softening, like thawing from a long winter. Mason never contacted me again. I think he knew better. Or maybe he was too embarrassed, too caught up in the wreckage to reach out. I didn't need his apology. I had stopped writing versions of myself that made space for him a long time ago. There was a time when I would have begged for a conversation, some final scene to close the curtain. But I'd since realized closure isn't something you wait to be handed. It's something you build, brick by brick, every time you choose not to go back. Eli sent me one message 2 weeks later, just a thank you. No updates about Clarissa, no emotional weight, just gratitude. I replied the same way. Simple, clean, honest. Whatever unfolded between him and Clarissa wasn't mine to hold. We had intersected at a moment when both of us needed a mirror, and we offered that to each other without expectation. That, in itself, was enough. Work became a refuge again. I poured myself into new projects, mentored a younger analyst who reminded me of myself a few years ago, ambitious, eager, still trying to be liked more than respected. I found myself telling her what I wish someone had told me. You don't owe anyone your burnout. You don't earn love through exhaustion. Let people earn the right to your soft places. That conversation stuck with me. It made me realize how far I'd come. Not in the traditional, Instagrammable way, not with promotions or glossy announcements, but in how I thought about myself. I no longer saw heartbreak as failure. I no longer saw being alone as a void to fill. I had stopped chasing the kind of love that required me to shrink. I moved apartments in early spring. Nothing dramatic, just a small studio closer to Prospect Park, with tall windows and creaky floors that sang under my feet. I painted one wall a deep navy, bought a velvet armchair secondhand, and filled the space with plants that demanded sunlight and attention. It felt like me. Not the me Mason knew. Not the me Clarissa mocked. Just me, without the noise. One night, I sat down at my tiny kitchen table and reopened the folder I'd kept hidden on my laptop. The one labeled Someday. Inside were essays, drafts, half-finished thoughts about identity, relationships, grief, and growth. I started editing, revising, adding new words with an older, wiser voice, and then I started posting them anonymously on a blog, just to see what would happen. The first post went unnoticed. So did the second. But the third, a piece titled The Weight of Being the Strong One, got shared, and then shared again. Messages started trickling in. Strangers telling me my words felt like their thoughts, that they had stayed too long, that they had forgotten what it meant to belong to themselves. I didn't respond to every message, but I read them all. And with every comment, I felt something repairing inside me. Not because I was helping anyone else, but because I was finally telling the truth, in a voice that wasn't edited for comfort. One afternoon, as I walked through the park with the first hints of spring blooming around me, I passed a couple sitting on a bench. They looked young, maybe early 20s. He was speaking, fast and animated, hands moving in sharp gestures. She was nodding quietly, eyes down, fingers tightening around a coffee cup. I knew that look. I had worn it too many times. It was the look of someone learning to silence herself just to keep the peace. I didn't stop. It wasn't my place. But I thought about her all day, about how many of us learn to confuse control for care, how long it takes to unlearn the idea that love must cost us something to be real. I started volunteering on weekends, a nonprofit that helped women rebuild their lives after emotionally abusive relationships. It wasn't a grand gesture. I wasn't trying to save anyone, but I sat with them, listened to their stories, handed out resource packets, sometimes just made tea and offered silence. And I saw myself in every room, not the pain, the rebuilding, the small quiet courage of starting again. Clarissa reached out once, months after the wedding. A short email. She didn't apologize, not exactly. But she thanked me for being kind the night she visited the apartment with Mason. She said seeing Eli again was a mirror she hadn't expected. That walking away was the hardest thing she'd ever done. And that she was trying to figure out who. She was without the noise. I didn't reply, not out of anger. Just out of respect. For her, for me, for the boundary we both now knew was necessary. The final thread of my story with Mason came quietly. I bumped into his mother at a grocery store. She didn't recognize me at first, but when she did, her face fell slightly. Not with shame, but with the tired softness of someone who had watched too many things fall apart. We spoke briefly. She said Mason had moved back home for a while, that he was struggling to get back on his feet, that things hadn't turned out how he expected. I nodded. I wished her well. And as I walked away, I felt no triumph, only distance. Like passing a town you once lived in, realizing you no longer know the streets. The last essay I wrote for the blog was titled Rewriting the Ending. It wasn't about Mason, or Eli, or Clarissa. It was about me. About how we are taught that closure comes with confrontation, that healing requires a scene. But what I've learned is that healing often looks like boredom, like stability, like grocery shopping without crying, like making plans that don't revolve around anyone else's chaos. I ended the post with this. You don't need to burn the past to build the future. You just need to stop dragging the ashes into every room you enter. It got shared more than anything I had ever written, and maybe that was the real ending. Or maybe it was just another beginning, but this time, I was the one holding the pen. Zoe's journey began not with heartbreak, but with hope. Hope for love, hope for partnership, and hope for a shared life built on mutual respect and growth. But what unfolded in her relationship with Mason was something many people experience, but few know how to escape. The slow, invisible erosion of self under the weight of someone else's unmet potential. At first, their connection felt honest and raw, forged in the fire of financial hardship and family wounds. Zoe, determined and compassionate, extended more than just her heart. She gave her space, her energy, her time, and, most critically, her dreams. Mason, once full of charm and passion, slowly revealed a dependency not on love, but on convenience. Zoe became the caretaker in their relationship, managing the home, the bills, the chores, and the emotional weight of their partnership. All while Mason leaned deeper into his comfort, offering excuses in place of effort and entitlement, in place of appreciation. It wasn't one explosive moment that shattered Zoe's illusions. It was the accumulation of being unseen, of giving without reciprocation, and of being told that her exhaustion was unwarranted. When Zoe found the strength to set boundaries, to demand equality in both emotional labor and financial responsibility, the truth of their relationship became clear. Mason had never seen her as a partner. He saw her as a stepping stone, someone to carry him until someone better came along. That someone, he believed, was Clarissa. Wealthy, beautiful, and emblematic of the life he thought he deserved. Mason's betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It was a profound dismissal of everything Zoe had poured into their relationship. He left, without remorse, and moved on as if she were just a chapter, not the co-author of his recovery. But Zoe didn't shatter. She rebuilt. She discovered that healing is not a straight line. It's a mosaic of quiet victories. Paying rent alone, cooking, for herself, rediscovering lost hobbies and learning to breathe in silence. Then came the invitation. Not a gesture of peace, but a taunt. Mason wanted her to witness his supposed upgrade. He wanted to parade his success, not just in love, but in life. What he didn't anticipate was that Zoe had already transformed. She was no longer the woman he had known, no longer willing to be diminished. With thoughtful precision, Zoe chose her response. Not out of vengeance, but clarity. She invited Eli, Clarissa's ex, not to disrupt the wedding, but to reclaim her place in a story she had been erased from. What followed was poetic justice. Clarissa, confronted by her own unresolved feelings, chose to walk away. Mason, left humiliated, was finally forced to face the reality that the life he had built was constructed on illusions. But the real story isn't about a ruined wedding. It's about Zoe's evolution. After the chaos, she didn't gloat. She didn't spiral. She continued forward, moved into a new space that reflected her inner world, and returned to her passions. Her writing, once stifled by a relationship that demanded her silence, became a vessel for connection and truth. Through her blog, she reached others who had been where she once was, strangers who read her words and found pieces of themselves. Her story became more than personal. It became collective. She volunteered, she mentored. She offered empathy where others had only offered judgment. Her journey wasn't about becoming hardened. It was about becoming whole. Clarissa's email months later, Mason's mother in the grocery store, Eli's final message. These weren't plot twists. They were reminders that healing doesn't erase the past. It reframes it. Zoe learned that the ending she thought she wanted, a romantic resolution, an apology, some grand validation, was never what she truly needed. What she needed was to rewrite her story with herself at the center. And that's exactly what she did. Not with rage, but with resilience. Not with bitterness, but with boundaries. Not by tearing others down, but by building herself up. She found peace in the everyday. In grocery shopping without crying. In reading a book without checking her phone. In sitting at a cafe alone and not feeling lonely. In no longer searching for someone to complete her, because she had already returned to herself. So what is the lesson here? Zoe's story teaches us that love is not about sacrifice without recognition. It's not about holding space for someone who won't grow. Real love, whether from a partner or from within, is about reciprocity. It's about being seen, heard, and valued. When someone consistently makes you feel small, makes you question your worth, or relies on your exhaustion as a foundation for their comfort, that is not love. That is emotional labor masquerading as devotion. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away. Not with a dramatic exit, but with quiet determination. By choosing yourself again. By making space in your life, not just for healing, but for joy. For solitude that doesn't ache, for love that doesn't deplete. Zoe didn't win by ruining a wedding. She won by surviving herself. By refusing to stay in a narrative that painted her as less than. By rewriting her ending not around someone else's validation, but around her own voice. That voice became her freedom, her strength, her new beginning. How can you apply this to your own life? Start small. Pay attention to the relationships that drain you. Reflect on how often you compromise in silence. Ask yourself, when was the last time you felt truly seen? The last time someone gave to you without expectation? Make space for stillness. Get comfortable being alone. Learn the sound of your own voice before inviting someone else to share the silence. And if you're carrying someone else's dream, set it down. You are not a bridge for someone else's success. You are your own home. Use Zoe's journey as a mirror, not just a story. Let it remind you that your worth isn't determined by how much you endure. That boundaries are not walls. They are doors you close to protect the peace you've fought to create. And finally, when someone sends you an invitation to their life with the intention of making you feel small, show up. Not to prove them wrong, but to remind yourself that you never needed their approval in the first place. If Zoe's story resonated with you, if you saw even a fragment of yourself in her strength, her heartbreak, or her healing, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter, stories that reflect the messiness, beauty, and truth of being human. Every like, comment, and subscription gives us the motivation to continue, crafting narratives that aren't just entertaining, but empowering. So hit that subscribe button. Join this growing community of resilient hearts and courageous voices, because the next story might just be the one that changes everything for you. Thank you for watching. And remember, you are the author of your life. Don't be afraid to rewrite the ending.